And what I think is one of the most important facets of constructing urban living shorelines is this ability for them to serve as educational and stewardship tools to connect people with the water in places where a lot of times people have been told to largely be afraid of the water.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hey, podcast listeners. We're about to listen to an interview that Tony did with an expert in living shorelines. But before we did that, I wanted to look at some comments and read them from listeners who've been reaching out to us. I'll start off with an email discussion I had with Julie Dunlap about the title to our episode, quote, "Science versus the Cat Hoarders," unquote. We had too long an exchange to relate here, but the concern was that the title, quote, "gives away the position of the podcast host before evidence is presented about the role of cats in wildlife destruction," unquote, and sets science up as a biased position to start with. Julie also recommended we discuss challenges harmonizing multiple uses in public green spaces with conservation goals, in particular, mountain biking in nature reserves and that sort of thing. This is a hot topic in Philadelphia parks and frankly a bit of a trigger for Tony and me, so perhaps we will tackle that in the future. Thanks, Julie, for writing us. We also got a great email from Susan Grimbley suggesting we do an episode about urban robins. That sounds neat, and I'll chip in the idea that it would be fun to do one both about American urban robins and European urban robins, two bird species not related to each other at all, but both comfortable living around humans and adapting to cities. Last, I will mention a note from listener John Paul Peter from Kentucky, who says he particularly likes episodes about outdoor cats, and pointed out that many of the cats people try to adopt from maintained stray populations end up having cat illnesses. In particular, he mentioned feline leukemia or FIV, and ultimately these cats have to be put down. And so these outdoor populations serve as reservoirs for those illnesses. John asked if we'd done any episodes about urban bats. We did do one about bat rescue, but I do think, now that he mentions it, that we are overdue for an actual episode about urban bat natural history or ecology. If a listener out there is an urban bat researcher, please drop us a note at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. We'd love to get you on the podcast. Thanks again for everybody for writing, and let's get on with the episode.
I'll tell you what. Hi, welcome to, this might be the Urban Wildlife Podcast. This might be Nature's Hype Man, but regardless, it's part of the Wildlife Observer Network. And I'm here with an old friend of mine, Josh Moody. Is that how you like to be called? Or is it Joshua?
Josh is fine.
Yeah, Josh Moody. Sometimes people, when they get professional, they use their full name.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
pretty relaxed that way.
I was just laughing because I had to check my phone and had to stop the recording briefly because I decided to make banana bread, and Josh will laugh because we've been having some trouble, mostly entirely on my end, about scheduling this because I'm bad at remembering. I have ADD, and I have sometimes bad at remembering appointments, and especially bad when it's such a weird time in society right now where I don't necessarily know what day of the week it is. We had a holiday, so I'm like Tuesday is. Like I would have worked the full day, and then there'd be the next day, and then it was like, no, we'll have off on Monday, but it's weird to be off because I'm home anyway, so it's strange. And then like I thought we were doing this yesterday, but it's today. And then of course another example of how ADD gets to me. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna make banana bread, and I'm like, yeah, I have plenty of time to make it, but I have to take it out of the oven. In 55 minutes. So I just had to confirm with the missus that she was getting the banana bread out.
Well, if it's a little well done, you can always put a little ice cream on it to help.
Yes. And we got some last night, we did
You're all set. You got a backup plan.
Yeah. Have you been doing the Amazon, the Prime Now from Whole Foods?
No.
It'll make you never want to go to the grocery store again. Like I go to the grocery store now and I am livid. I'm so angry. I'm like so frustrated. It's so nice to just type what you want in. You can really manage your budget.
Yeah.
You look at the price in the cart, and then Yeah, and like there's a little bit of a charge, but honestly, what you save in wasted food makes up for it. But we're here to talk about living shorelines, right? So you're like a pioneer punk rocker in getting academic. I think you were like at least of our crew, of like our generation. So I know Josh from the punk scene, and I think he was like one of the first to actually like go back to school and get academic. And you got a PhD, am I correct?
Yeah, I got my bachelor's in biology from Temple. I got a master's in ecology from Rutgers, and then my PhD's from Drexel in environmental science.
That is awesome. And you started back. You weren't like you took a little break between like you went a little bit later, right? You weren't.
Oh yeah, I took I call it my 20 semesters off. I went back to school at 28. I started actually CCP, and then transferred over to Temple from there.
I did the exact same thing, but at like in my 30s, you know.
Yeah. I was close, 28. I think that was in let's see, about 2007, or I'm sorry, like 2004, 2003.
Nice. I called it my 14-year rock and roll vacation. So. Yeah. But it's cool, yeah. And
it's an exhausting vacation, though.
It is. It's funny when you realize, you know, you're so against like going like living a normal life. The idea of like a 40-hour week, and only weekends off is like frightening when you're like a 19-year-old punk rocker.
Yeah.
But then after like, you know, working security till 3 a.m, and then like, you know, maybe like having to go right from that to a demo job because you got to make money when the opportunities come to make money, you got to do it. And you're like, you know, getting your, you know, blowing your knee out as a bike messenger. You're like, huh.
But you know what? I think that sort of coming from the punk scene really puts you in a good frame of mind for doing environmental work, because when you think about it, environmental work, there's nothing for certain. There's no replicates. Things are always changing. You constantly have to adapt and deal with situations as they arise, and you've got to think out of the box constantly. So if you're not used to security and things being neat and organized, this kind of work won't give you a heart attack right away.
Yeah.
You know?
Amen. And I've told a story before, but my first field gig, I went up to New York City to interview with Robert Rockwell, who we've actually had on this podcast already, about working at snow geese up in the Arctic. And I was doing this interview with him, and he only asked me a little bit about birds. He started asking me more questions about like what I would do if we're snowed, you know, if it's fog. We're working in the densest polar bear population in the world. And there's fog. You can't go outside because you can't see the giant white predator is going to eat you, right? And so, like, what are you going to do if we're fogged in for 4 days? Like, do you like to cook? Do you play cards? And I'm like, he wants to know if he can get along with me. And I said, you know what? I'm in a band. I tour the world. I'm stuck in a van with 4 other guys. I know how to get along with people. I'm like, I'm what you call a road dog. And he goes, road dog. I like that. Let's do it. And he took me up there. So
it's funny that you bring up the van, because when we interview people and we're hiring people, you know, there's some people that I work with that really focus on the resumes, but the interview for me is the biggest thing. And anyone that I work with who listens to this, I call it it's the get in the van test.
Yeah.
Because if you can't sit in a room and get along and engage, and you're not going to be able to sit in a van with them for like 5 hours round trip going to field sites, it may not be a good fit. And so that personality alignment, I find, is key to having a really good creative team, for sure. And I think, it's the total get in the van.
And, you know, being what I do, I get asked to go to schools for like career days and to talk to kids about like do career mentoring. And the one thing I always bring up is like, because I don't think I see the other people go ahead of me, and I'm like, they're not saying the thing that there's something being missed here. And that is like, you got to present yourself as someone people can get along with. And you got to present yourself like you're interested in the job that you're doing now. because I feel like so many kids are like, they present themselves like this is just a way station to get somewhere else. And like, and no one's going to want to hire you for that. And no one's going to want to hire you if you don't seem like you're a fun, nice person to get along with.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think maybe we lucked out and coming from the background we came from, we were so letting our regular personality come through was so ingrained with us. We didn't really have an option on how necessarily we were going to present ourselves. It was going to kind of come through anyway. So we might have ended up in good positions because we connected with people just naturally the way that we've always connected with people. But I sometimes feel bad for, younger people coming up and they're trying to figure out, who should I be in this interview? Who do they want to see? Or, what do I want to project? And I at least I know when I interview people, I at least try to create an environment where we can sort of, break down the walls a little bit and they end up getting comfortable and just, you can start to see that, what they relax into it. And I find a lot of the times when you work with people, because most of the people I work with are a lot younger than me, that, and actually my boss and my mentor, Danielle Krieger's like that too. She just set such a good tone and people became so relaxed that, you could really just get a feel for who each other were. And once people get comfortable in a situation, I think they really do the best and they're the things they're most interested in as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things you're most interested in, so you do living we're talking about living shorelines, and we'll probably go from there. But let's start with that, and tell us about your organization, and what your main focus is and how it fits into everything.
Well, so I'm the restoration programs manager at Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and Partnership for the Delaware Estuary is one of the 28 national estuary programs around the country. So we're the estuary program for the Delaware River and Bay. And what that really means is it's the tidal portion that goes from saltwater up to freshwater and, and the land that drains into that area. So, because we're an estuary program, we get a little bit of our funding through the EPA's Clean Water Act. And so we're a clean water organization. All the work that we do in some way relates back to clean water, healthy habitats, strong communities, that kind of thing. And so when I was at Rutgers University, I was working at a shellfish lab there. And the science director at Partnership for the Delaware Estuary was interested in bringing this technique called living shorelines, which had been more commonly used down south in the U.S., up into this area. Now, I was working at a shellfish lab, and my advisor, Danielle, or my director, Danielle, she's a shellfish ecologist by training as well. And the thoughts that her and Dave Bushek, the director of the Haskin Lab, had was, well, for living shorelines, what we really want to do is figure out a way that we can use the local ecology in this area to take some of the applications of living shorelines that have been used and sort of make them our own here. Now, previously, living shorelines, especially down in Maryland and Virginia, was really a particular thing. It was almost like a rock sill along an eroding shoreline with a lot of wetland vegetation planted on top of it. So it had almost become living shorelines synonymous with a technique, if you will. Now, the idea here, by bringing it up here, is we wanted to see how many different ways we could think about living shorelines. Is it really just a singular technique, or is it something a little bit more? So really the test that we started out with in around 2008 in the Delaware Bay was really looking at the relationship between rib mussels and salt marsh coregrass, Spartina alterniflora. It's typically a monoculture along most salt marshes. Grows up into the high marsh, a little bit taller down where it's flooded more frequently. And so rib mussels in this grass have a really synergistic relationship. Where the grass provides a place for the mussels to burrow down in. The mussels being a filter feeder, they pull a lot of nutrients out. Some they keep to build tissue. Some they deposit in the ground, which becomes fertilizer for the plant. So you get this kind of positive feedback loop where the bigger the plant gets, the more mussels can kind of gather around and attach to it. And then the more they fertilize, the bigger the plants get. And as the muscles, using these protein complexes called byssal threads, which are extremely strong, bind to the roots of those plants, they can help to hold shoreline edges together. So the idea was to take this natural sort of mutualistic relationship and use that as the foundation, as the living point to help, curb some of the erosion in living shoreline applications. So, we've worked on that with Rutgers University for a number of years. We have a number of different living shorelines out there. And what I think we really served as, the organization that I work for, Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, sort of like a testing lab. We get these ideas, these research questions, we go out and we try to implement them, learn from them, and pass them on. And now this particular technique of living shoreline has been used by a few different organizations in Delaware and New Jersey. But we use these in lower energy areas. And, not all areas are the same. As we start to move into these urban areas, these highly energetic areas, big ships are going by. But there's a whole ecology around them. Not a single technique is going to work everywhere in every location. So what is our opportunities for living shoreline applications across a variety of diverse habitats, right? And so whereas in Maryland, to sort of loop this back, a living shoreline became a particular type of installation. It was a particular type of materials oriented in a particular manner in a particular type of location to address a particular circumstance, erosion. We in this area, and when I say we, it's, our organization works very closely with the states of Delaware, New Jersey, a lot of the other academic institutions and NGOs in the area, such as TNC, Riverfront North Partnership up in Philadelphia. The sort of consensus we came to is that, if a living shoreline's function is to promote life, it's really not about the types of materials that you put in somewhere. For something to be a living shoreline, it needs to be functioning as a living shoreline. So the concept of the living shoreline in this area has started to move away from a specific type of tactic, but more into this idea of function. Something functions as a living shoreline, as providing ecological uplift. And now what that does is that opens the door to a whole variety of different tactics that could be considered living shorelines, because ultimately, at the end of the day, a living shoreline is an engineered structure. You are taking some materials, you are putting them in a location, you want that to, typically attenuate erosion or maybe help build elevation. But at the same time, you want it to promote life. So you put these materials down, they're going to affect the physical conditions, which will affect the biological conditions at the site, which will then feed back. So by thinking of a living shoreline in terms of its functionality, we open the door for all these different techniques to be considered living shorelines if they're designed with ecological components that can support life. And how do we know if they are meeting their goals, their ecological goals? How do we know if they're functioning? And this brings it really sort of dovetails it with the scientific method, is you need to monitor all of these installations. You need to know ecologically how it's performing before you did anything to the area, and you need to track some metrics that are related to your goals afterwards. And by doing that, we can see if things are functioning as living shorelines, and if they're providing ecological function, and they're providing ecological uplift, it may not matter the constituents that comprise the structure itself. It's really what it's doing. And now you got to be careful, right? Because you don't want people putting a bunch of potted plants on top of bulkheads and calling it a living shoreline. Look, I got grass growing on this wall. You really want to think holistically about the whole ecology in the area and see how this structure is the function and the effects of it are radiating out through the variety of habitats it's placed within. But what it does is it allows, thinking of it as a function, allows us to address the ecological implications of hard armoring in areas like urban habitats, where it's going to be really hard to do something soft, just because the way energy is bouncing around. So if we're going to try to build elevation with sea level rise, we're going to try to stem erosion and keep critical habitats there. Under certain energetic conditions, we're going to need to heavily engineer stuff. But if we can make a priority of those designs also enhancement of ecological function while we're doing this, then we start to get into a place where we can move forward in these areas and really building out these habitats and creating the proper conditions for them to persist under these different areas. So living shorelines is always a developing field. As I mentioned earlier, we've worked down in the Delaware Bay and more natural habitats. I can talk a little bit about some work we're doing up in the Schuylkill River, across the Delaware River in Camden. There's group Riverfront North who's been doing some work up in Northeast Philadelphia. And what our role, our partnership for the Delaware Estuary, how we view our role is to sort of bring together these different groups whose skill sets are needed to create something that's functional. Bring them together, sort of pilot these ideas. Our organization, and one of my roles in it, is to develop monitoring plans, collect data, analyze data. So design these experiments, implement them, collect data on them, learn from them, and then help promote the techniques that there's evidence for them working.
This is really, really cool stuff you're doing here. And could you walk us through some of the, I'd say, ecosystem services that these are providing?
Sure. Typical. So we've authored a couple of documents. One in Delaware with partners at TNC and New Jersey DEP, and these are and one also in Delaware with the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee. And both of these groups are groups that have put together these documents were groups of diverse stakeholders from public, private, NGO, academic sectors. And what both of these documents do is outline a couple of specific goals, different goals that living shorelines can have. So in terms of ecosystem function, one goal that living shorelines can always have is erosion control. And now, depending on what's being eroded, there's quite a few different functions that could be affected there. You can be thinking about things like carbon sequestration through vegetation proliferation, storage below ground in roots and dead biomass. You can think about habitat creation and persistence for different types of fauna that require certain types of habitat for different life stages. You can think about the intertidal portions of them as helping to support fisheries as nursery habitats for young fish. You can think about nitrogen cycling, not only through the plants taking nitrogen out of the water, through their production of biomass, but if you incorporate shellfish into living shorelines, which is something our organization does, we have about 4 or 5 of us all have backgrounds in shellfish ecology and physiology. Shellfish are a great ecosystem engineer, so they can help build benthic infauna habitats, which are great for fish foraging. They can help cycle nutrients from the water column down to the benthos, also to the vegetation to remove those from the system, reducing algal blooms. You can think about living shorelines providing resiliency along coasts by helping to build elevation and trap sediment. So there's a variety of different services that living shorelines can provide. And one of the things that we like to talk about a lot is when we're approached with a location. Someone's like, all right, I've got an issue here. And the issue is typically erosion or something that they really want to be there other than the land is disappearing, some type of habitat. We're interested in doing something here. We really want to stop this erosion, but we just don't want to, throw some rock down. What can we do ecologically? And so what's really important to create a really good functioning living shoreline is to understand the ecological conditions, what currently exists, and what is possible to exist in that area, what would be natural to exist there for that specific site. Because once you understand how the site is functioning now and you understand what could be enhanced, you can start setting goals. Which are these goals? What do we really need? Flood reduction. Are we looking at an elevation-based goal? Are we talking about erosion? We have an erosion control-based goal or a habitat enhancement goal. But what's nice is once you outline that, then you can start thinking about all those different associated services that come along with it. And a lot of them are going to have to do with nutrient sequestration, habitat proliferation, and especially refuge for all different types of juvenile, animals, fish, flora, fauna of different types. So I think living shorelines can meet a bunch of different goals, and typically they meet a variety of them. One living shoreline that we're developing over in Camden, New Jersey with their municipal utility authority, the wastewater treatment plant. Part of its function, there's going to be freshwater mussel beds there that will help with nutrient reduction. Not only will they help pull nutrients out of the water column, they'll help increase benthic infauna, which will be better fish foraging habitat. The vegetation in and of itself will be nice habitat for birds that come through. So there's the service of providing the habitat for the bird, but then there's also the service for the community. People who like to look at the birds, they can come out and have a place where they can, foster their stewardship potential along these shorelines. And actually, to take a little side tangent, that I think is one of the services of living shorelines that constantly is either overlooked or maybe undervalued. And where I think is one of the most important facets of constructing urban living shorelines is this ability for them to serve as educational and stewardship tools to connect people with the water in places where a lot of times people have been told to largely be afraid of the water, or that it's like a dirty place and you shouldn't go near it, or you shouldn't worry about it. And there's a lot of opportunity to foster that stewardship through education, through connection. By increasing these habitats, you give people something to look at, something to learn about. And then, you're an educator, as well as me, once people understand something a little bit, they start to care about it. And then once they start to care about it, they're sort of interested in protecting it. So a lot of different benefits, spanning a lot of different topics for living shorelines.
Yeah. So this hits close to home. A lot of what you're saying. I don't know if you know this about me. You probably do, but I actually grew up in Northeast Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I grew up in Wissinoming and then Mayfair, and we would bike down to the river to go fishing, and there's no natural shore. There's like very little natural shoreline on the Delaware, and there's very little natural shoreline on the Schuylkill River, right? So, like you said, you go down there and there's just no, it's just a concrete drop off, and so in Philadelphia, unfortunately, in Camden as well, which is a city across the river. Remember, not just us listening to this, right? There's going to be people who don't know about Philadelphia. And Camden is kind of like Philly's Gary, Indiana, right? Or like Philly's Compton, right? It's not a suburb. It's a city that's like directly across the river from Philadelphia. So it's just as urban as Philadelphia. It just happens to be in New Jersey. And so I guess because we're an old city, we've developed this. Our riverbanks have been industrialized, and there's very little places you can actually go in and enjoy a beautiful view of the river. Right, you go down there and it's just concrete. So I love these ideas of these living shorelines, providing some aesthetic value, which is not to be understated. So what? How do those? One thing I've always been curious about is when you mentioned birds, I assume it's more like herons and like wading, like herons and egrets and those, right? Shorebirds need mud flats. Is there any way to make an artificial mud flat, or man-made mud flat? The problem there is because if they're too static, they'll get covered in vegetation, and then it'll be more like heron habitat rather than shorebird habitat. Is something possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. And I think one of the main overarching philosophical discussions that constantly happens around living shoreline implementation is typically if you're going to build something somewhere, you're building it on top of something else, right? So you're always involved in a habitat trade-off issue, pretty much. So if you're thinking about, okay, this marsh has been eroding, well, now it is a mudflat habitat. And a mudflat habitat has a lot of ecological service and value to it. So one of the things in thinking about appropriate places to put in living shorelines is you don't want to end up in a place where you're, the robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. We're going to vastly reduce one habitat in order to promote another one. But typically, because of the erosion rates in a lot of the areas where this happens, I mean, some places down in the Delaware Bay are losing up to like 6 feet of marsh a year. So you have a lot of times an overwhelming availability of mudflat habitat. And so the small amounts of marsh that you put in aren't really skewing that balance too much. But you do want to be careful, because if it is an area that is being heavily utilized by something, you may not want to mess with it, right? Because erosion is also a natural process. Erosion and accretion should be happening, but they should be happening in some sort of balance. A place should be eroding somewhere and a place should be accreting somewhere. So it is important, the first thing to say is definitely it's important to think about the location where you're putting something, because you are always converting habitat. But it's interesting when you mention like, oh, could we just build out a mudflat living shoreline? See, a lot of people associate a living shoreline with vegetation because that was largely, what they were used for. You were building a marsh on top of something. But if we start to think about a living shoreline as a measure of function, all we're going to be doing to make it a living shoreline is you are doing something to the area, installing something to create some sort of ecological benefit that could persist. Now, when you think about flooding in an area and you think about water getting into areas, one good way to keep water from getting into areas is to build a hill. It takes a lot of energy for water to go up a hill. It typically would rather spread out than go up. It needs pressure behind it. So one of the types of things that we've been talking about working with is this idea. So you might build a vegetated portion of your living shoreline, but then out in front of it, you may want to be augmenting the slope, right? You're going to keep it a mudflat habitat. You still want it to be underwater, but you want it to sort of keep water at bay. But that mudflat itself can be part of that living shoreline. So I think building unvegetated slopes would most certainly be a component. And as we get into, these larger living shorelines, a lot of the pilot projects that have been done, are pretty small, 80 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet. There's a lot of proof of concept. But as we start as a region getting into these bigger, larger designs, which is the direction that we're going in Delaware and New Jersey for sure, and Pennsylvania is starting as well, is what we're going to see is a living shoreline is really, if it's along a greater stretch, is going to be a whole suite of sub-tactics. I think a perfect example of that is right now in Philadelphia behind the Walmart along the Delaware River, along 4 of the piers there. The Delaware River Waterfront Corporation is, involved in redesigning that waterfront there to serve multiple goals: habitat, bird habitat, fish habitat, mussel habitat, and recreational opportunity as well. And when you start to see these bigger ones, they're going to have all these subcomponents, subtidal portions, focusing on SAV and mussels, maybe intertidal portions with this augmented slope that would be good for birds foraging at low tide, as well as vegetative portions. Now in the Delaware Bay, thinking about red knots and horseshoe crabs and things like that who prefer sandy habitats, the American Littoral Society down there does a lot of great work doing beach restoration, specifically, targeting, red knot foraging habitat, trying to, enhance that and make it appropriate. And I think all those different goals can easily fall under this umbrella of living shorelines, as long as you can prove it. You got to be evaluating it. You've got to be looking at it, and you need a goal to track your change against. And if it's functioning and it's supporting life, and they can do that in a myriad of ways, this is a living shoreline to me.
So mostly you're doing areas where the natural shoreline has been eroded, are you doing work where the body of water, the river, has been channelized, and like huge stretches of Schuylkill are just all concrete? Is there any way to like? I know I've seen some like floating like structures. Are they considered living shorelines, or is there any way to like, I'm thinking like shorebirds, whatnot, migrating up over Philadelphia, like some of the areas that are protected would be along the Schuylkill or the Delaware or like East Park Reservoir, which but the banks are too steep or concrete. So is there any way to like mount something that could provide that kind of habitat, or is that out of the scope of what we're talking about here?
No, I think it's within the scope, and I think this is a new area, and I can talk about two specific projects. In terms of like the bulkhead itself, like this is sort of a greening up the gray kind of thing. And you run into this with homeowners a lot, whether people have bulkheads or rocks, things like that. A lot of times people don't want to take them out, but they wouldn't mind converting them into habitat if they can. But also in certain places, it doesn't make any sense to take them out because, you have critical infrastructure behind them. You need them to stay there, but what can we do on top of them, in front of them? So directly to augment the bulkhead itself, there's actually some people down in Maryland and some people in Delaware now that are working with these sort of marsh Oregon type of things. It's almost like, how in the backyard of the city you can hang something on your wall where it's got all the different plants. It's like the bio wall and University. But people are looking at different things like that. And that's one method. Whether that itself is a living shoreline or more of the just like, putting plants on gray infrastructure, I think would more fall in a second category. But if you're in an intertidal area where the tide does go out and you have this area in front of it and some subtidal area to work in, you can do something. So the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority in Camden, New Jersey, that we're working with a private firm. We're working with them, and then they contracted to a private firm, Stantec, to design this, and we're the ones that are making sure that it's ecologically sound and helping develop the habitats. This is a giant 20-foot seawall, goes about 1,200 feet, and there's nothing in front of it. Some soft mud, some rocks. It's poor foraging habitat, no submerged aquatic vegetation community. You don't really see anything going on there. So this is one of those examples of having to potentially use techniques that in and of themselves may not be considered green, but because of their presence, you can get this radiating ecological uplift. So the current design for this location is there would be a series of wave breakwaters set out a pretty good distance from this, maybe about 100 feet in front of it. And so what those are going to do, these rock breakwaters, is they're going to attenuate shipping waves. Why is nothing there? Well, because these giant barges are going by and the energy's hitting these walls, like you say in the Schuylkill, and it's just bouncing everywhere. It's digging out anything that's going to grow on the substrate. It's just creating an extremely inhospitable environment for anything to persist. But you start to deal with that energy first. So you put something in to deal with the energy. Now that the energy is attenuated behind it, in the subtidal portion, in the lee of these breakwaters, is perfect mussel habitat. So you install freshwater mussel pens down in this area. That's going to start bringing fish in and things like that. Freshwater mussels are also, very well associated with enhanced aquatic vegetation growth. They help to clear the water a little bit. They pass the nutrients on. And now once the energy is reduced and you have this bit of nutrient cycling going on behind it, you start to see some sediment probably getting trapped back there. The elevation is going to raise a little bit. You can start planting that, and then you start getting an emerging marsh come out there. So it's almost like this succession of habitats. You look at this, the primary problem is going to be the energy. You do something to reduce the energy, and as that gets reduced, you can do something else to build up a subhabitat. And then you can get this ecological succession going on behind it. And over time, you can start to build up a natural habitat that would be there if the energetic conditions were not in play. And that, even though there's a bulkhead behind it, I would consider a living shoreline. You've engineered something, you've put it into place, and if the different plant and animal communities are persisting and enhanced as a result of that, you now have a living shoreline. Another example is at Bartram's Gardens in Philadelphia. So Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, where I work, is in the process of building the world's first mussel hatchery aimed at nutrient mitigation. So typically freshwater mussel hatcheries are, U.S. Fish and Wildlife runs quite a few of them, and they're there to help propagate threatened and endangered species. But freshwater mussels are one of the most endangered and imperiled animals in America. There's a whole variety of taxa that are more or less gone that used to be natural to this area. But there's still quite a few common species. So at Bartram's, PDE's working with them to build this hatchery there. I think we break ground maybe late this year, early next year, to propagate mussels, to put them out, to filter nutrients, to get removed, to help pull nutrients out of the water. But because of that, we're working on a few different things with that. And so they're in one of those areas, right, where they have the natural shoreline, but it's surrounded by all these seawalls, right? The whole Schuylkill River's armored. So what do we do there? Well, so we're working on a living shoreline there that we're going to start putting in the first components of this summer. The first thing we need to do is we need to see is if we can get the subaquatic things, plants and animals, to stay in place. So what we're using these containers of shell to, again, like a rock breakwater might do, but we're using a little bit more of a natural substrate, or I guess rocks are natural, but a little bit more habitat friendly. Shell, has all those little, holes and pathways through it that all sorts of little invertebrates and different types of animals can utilize. But anyway, we're going to subtidally put out a series of test structures to see if we can attenuate the energy, stabilize the bottom, and we're going to plant freshwater mussels that we've been producing and growing out from our test hatchery and at a variety of different ponds, Longwood Gardens, Winterthur, Delaware. We grow these mussels out, and we're going to put them out there. Once we can get the subtidal area a little stabilized, we can get some mussels in there going, then you start moving landward. But it's all about dealing with the most imminent condition that's causing the most problems and then working in a succession. So at a place like that, you wouldn't want to throw in a bunch of plants right away because the energy will just overwhelm them. So we start with that major problem. We start to attenuate that. And then once we get the proper conditions for life, we start trying to enhance that life there and give it a little bit of a jump start. So that's a place where we're going to be doing a lot of different experiments over the next few years. We're working with Army Corps, National Marine Fisheries Service, Philadelphia Water Department, and Pennsylvania, obviously state of Pennsylvania as well. There's going to be a lot of people keeping an eye on this. We're going to be looking at a lot of different types of information and hopefully be using that to develop sort of a plan for exactly that type of habitat that you're talking about. What are some techniques we can do here? And what's the mosaic of habitats that could be implemented? And what's the proper order to do that? Because the other thing to remember about a living shoreline is if it's alive, it's not going to be static, right? It's always going to be changing. You're going to have some types of vegetation come and go. Some might expand, some habitats might contract. There's going to be a whole lot of changes that could potentially happen as a result of either natural occurrence or, if it's in an urban area, unnatural interference as well. So part of the key to this is to implement these different types of habitats, put this mosaic together. So, thinking about niche ecology, if these things work together naturally anyway, as borders change, as things shift, there's going to be something there to take over the space as something starts moving out. Or if something contracts, something will always be able to move into that area. So thinking about the holistic ecology and these different types of things is sort of key for these really barren habitats like you're talking about. This is sort of a new area that we're getting in this region. And also nationally, urban living shorelines are a developing concept.
How many linear feet do you think, or meters for our global audience, do you think your organization or has been installed in this area?
Well, how many we've directly installed and that we conduct ongoing research on It's not that much. It's like 1,500, 2,000. It's not that big because we typically put out these experiments that we track over time. Now, we have our first installation that's still there went out in 2009. So we have installations that are a variety of ages, mostly down in the Delaware Bay and the tributaries, more in the brackish water with the salinity somewhere between, maybe 9 and 12, focusing on rib mussel, Spartina grass. But this Camden one, the one at Bartram's Garden, and we're actually starting some work up by the Fairmount Waterworks, putting together a conceptual design this year that'll go out for bid, hopefully next year, for installation, are really our first foray into the freshwater urban prism. And these are going to be longer because we're kind of at the point where people want to start working with living shorelines a lot more now than they did in 2009. And also to tell you the truth, the regulatory mechanisms are there now to permit these kind of activities that weren't really in place a decade ago. I mean, part of the problem with bringing a new technique into an area, someone's got to permit it. Quite a few people need to permit it. And if there's not the right boxes to check, that can be hard to do. There can be kind of a stalemate there. And, the states of New Jersey, state of Delaware, and now the state of Pennsylvania are really interested and have been, fundamental, foundational partners in moving this forward. So although the total amount of shoreline that we've done has been pretty small, those are things we've done on our own as research projects. We're now, living shorelines are at a place where now we're getting into these more collaborative projects. We're starting to think about bigger areas. So I think we're going to see regional numbers jump pretty significantly in like the next 5 years. Singular projects are going to be along the magnitude of like 1,000 feet, 300 meters, plus. So,
we're getting close to an hour now. Before we go, can you talk a little bit about climate change and how that affects what you're doing? And because the sea level rise is happening, I would assume that some of your projects could be too far underwater, but you also say that they help mitigate the effects of climate change. So could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of persistence over time and under a changing climate is always an ongoing active conversation in terms of living shorelines. Now that we're starting to talk about doing, bigger projects, that is now getting into part of the design. Is this project, do we think it's going to be able to trap the sediment? What's the adaptive management plan as water continues to rise? Will this be able to persist? Will it be able to trap enough sediment to be able to keep its elevation? If you're dealing with if you're dealing with vegetation of any sort, it's going to want to be flooded for some time of the day, and it's going to want to be exposed. So if you're dealing with vegetation at all, you're going to want to make sure that it is at a proper elevation within a tidal datum. So if you're dealing with this type of vegetation, will you be able to trap the sediment for the this living shoreline to grow vertically? And there's a couple of different techniques to do that, or a couple of different considerations. First, is the sediment available? Now, we're lucky. We live in a sediment-rich system. There's, you put your hand 3 inches down under the water of the Schuylkill or the Delaware, and it's gone. You can't even see it. So there's plenty of sediment out there. But trapping it, that's a whole nother issue. This is fast-moving water, and you really need to get water to slow down to release the particles in it. So that's where you get into the engineering. Are you creating baffling? Are you creating places to slow this water to give the plants the opportunity to do the trapping? Do we have the sediment? Do we have the mechanism to trap? And are those going to be able to persist over time? So a lot of that is going into the design plans now, for sure, in terms of living shorelines being able to persist. And so sometimes, and in some places under certain engineering, you can get a shoreline to keep pace and just work as a natural marsh. Then the question is it now a natural marsh, or is it still a living shoreline? That's a philosophical question that we love to kind of get down the rabbit hole on, but that's sort of up for grabs. But in some places, you may have to do periodic adaptive management. So if you think about a living shoreline like a garden, right? You got a garden in your backyard. You want to grow things. The things can grow here, but sometimes they need a little bit of attention. And so people had always thought like seawalls and things like that are great because it's like a set it, forget it. You put it in, you walk away, cool. So they've done it for a long time, and now they're realizing they're not that way. They need maintenance to it, and they need expensive maintenance. So living shoreline should always be, monitored. You should be evaluating how they're doing, and periodically, depending on the different stressor, you may need to go in periodically and do some adaptation. Say it's reached a point where it needs to grow further, but it's not trapping sediment on its own anymore. Maybe you go in and you put a few things in there to help facilitate the trapping of that sediment. So those are called adaptive management plans. What are we going to do when something starts going haywire? And nowadays, every living shoreline design that gets permitted should have one of those. There should be benchmarks that you're going for, should be monitoring to see how you're tracking to them, and what are you going to do if you don't. Now, as living shorelines are like sort of an emerging field, we're one of the groups that advocate for adaptive management plans, monitoring plans. It's not always required, but I think the regulatory agencies, both federal and state, they're having the active conversations about what sort of level should be in the statutes and should be required. So adaptive management, living shorelines might be able to do it on your own, but you should probably watch them because you may need to go in and tend them a little bit. In terms of mitigating the effects of climate change, that's an area of research right now. Like, how much carbon storage can we expect per linear foot in different habitats? There's a lot of different groups, and the National Estuary Research Reserve System is one of those primary examples of a national organization doing this type of research. What sort of carbon sequestration can we expect? We're working on it from the shellfish angle, closing that loop of, if nitrogen, they're filtering it out, how much gets returned to the environment, how much is long-term removed. So research closing the loops on what we can expect per linear foot or per square meter, however you want to think about it, by different habitat is ongoing. But I think in terms of mitigating climate change,
I meant more like the actual water level rise. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that's literally a physical engineering. You can certainly engineer slopes to keep water out. And if you're building in a place that you're trying to mitigate flooding, you just want to keep your eye on it. Make sure if it's trapping sediment and growing with sea level rise and keeping pace, it's good. If it starts falling behind, you might want to get in there and help facilitate trapping a little bit of sediment. So that's going to be an elevation issue, or maybe a hydrologic issue. If water's getting in, can't get out, or so much water is coming up in a river, it's pushing its way in. So hydrostatic pressure, that could be an issue too, but we haven't really seen that consideration yet.
Well, one final question that I have, and you might be the person to answer this. Where does the Delaware Bay actually start? Because the Delaware River basically takes a turn in Philly and then just gets wider and wider and wider and wider and wider. And then at some point they call it the Bay. So
yeah. Well, if you wanna think about two physical conditions where you could draw a line, you could think about salinity, and that's pretty close to the turbidity maximum as well, where the churning, you get the most turbid water. But the salinity line is generally around the Delaware Memorial Bridge, based on rainfall each year, drought, things like that. If it's a really dry year, the salt might come up a little further. If it's a really wet year, it might push down a little further too. But I don't know if there's an exact, overall agreed upon answer, but I would probably go with this generally around the salt line and around the Delaware Memorial Bridge. That's where we tend to see the vegetation really start to change. And
when you say salt line, is that going from salt to brackish or from brackish to fresh?
From brackish to fresh. So yeah, if we think about the salt gradient, obviously down in Lewis, Cape May, right there at the entrance to the bay, we have full salt water, and then it decreases coming up. So that would be the place where we could consider the freshwater habitat.
So blue crabs, I see blue crabs in Philly. Along the river in Philly, even way up in northeast Philly. So is that like is the salt like because of rainfall or what have you come up, or can they just tolerate a certain level of fresh water?
They can tolerate it. We see them in Wilmington, Delaware, a good bit too. I'm like now like mining my brain trying to remember some of the blue crab talks that I've seen, because blue crabs aren't an area of expertise for me, but it is common to see them, and it's not due to the salinity of the area. It's part of their migration or part of their movement that has to do with their life cycle and spawning, things like that.
Cool. Is there anything you want to make sure you say before we end that we might not have covered?
Well, I mean, one thing I can mention that's directly urban related is, I mentioned a few projects we're getting started with in Philadelphia, and, moving living shorelines up into the urbanized freshwater prism is a place where we're going to have a lot of activity over the next couple of years. And one of the things we're really interested in doing is really getting involved with this community stewardship potential of living shorelines. A lot of us involved in this are ecologists, and we're working on the ecology and working with engineers on the designs. But this nexus, the environmental justice nexus, the outreach potential, all of that is very high on our radar. And a lot of the models that we develop at PD are now starting to include community stewardship metrics to look at the potential for living shoreline in places. So I'm always happy to hear from people who have an interest in that. We also have a freshwater mussel program that has very strong community engagement portion of that program as well, where they like to get involved with educators. And one of the other things we're going to be doing is hopefully over the next year and a half in Pennsylvania, we'll be helping to develop the first PA Living Shorelines Committee. There's one in Delaware. There's basically a group in New Jersey. And now that this work is happening up in Philadelphia and the surrounding areas, we'll be looking to put together a Pennsylvania Living Shoreline Committee, which would comprise a whole suite of different types of practitioners and regulatory agents to keep an open conversation on what do living shorelines mean to us here, how do we see them developing, and how can we partner and pair the right people on the right projects to get the most out of it. So it'll really be a think tank with application for on-the-ground work. So I'll keep you informed when we start doing that. And, anyone who's interested in being a part of any of those things can just get my email address off the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary webpage and shoot me an email. I wouldn't give a call now. I've been really bad about checking my desk phone with the work at home thing, but emails.
Well, this might intersect with my actually professional career, because
I'm hoping so.
Yeah. We were talking about getting some mussels at our facility and into College Creek. And
and I got to tell you another thing, Tony, is that where there is a pretty big gap in the research is this overlap of bird usage on living shoreline. So Sarah Baboulis, who I work closely with on a lot of projects on this living shoreline we're putting in down in the Delaware Bay, we're going to try to implement a program down there where we're doing looking at bird use on them as well. There's been a couple studies, but none of them that I've seen have been real robust. We may contact you about that. But also up in Philadelphia, when we get this Bartram's work going in, which will probably be later this summer, and I'll keep you in the loop on that as well, we've got room in the monitoring plan to look to add additional metrics. So if there's something that in terms of birds, we would love to get that in there. And especially if there's a way for like citizen scientists or community groups to look at these too, we can help develop the data sheets, help compile the information and do the analysis for sure.
Yeah. Well, I help coordinate breeding bird surveys in Philadelphia green spaces. So we could do targeted ones for that. That would be great. I could do a lot of it myself. I could also get, organize a citizen science response to that question. I think that'd be great. It also sounds like a good PhD program at some point. I'm saying.
Could be. I'll tell you what, if people coming up in academic environments right now are thinking about going back to grad school, there is a lot of questions around living shorelines, a lot of ecological questions, a lot of engineering questions, and a lot of community nexus questions. There's a lot of work. lot of room for all sorts of research to be done around living shorelines. And what I think makes living shorelines work so exciting is, like I said, it's, at the beginning of this, there's always, you never really know what's going to happen. You're really getting in on the ground floor of these new techniques, these new ways of thinking about ecology and engineering and people all working together. So I would encourage anyone who's going back to school or thinking about some sort of graduate research project, to consider some application relative to living shorelines, because it's a extremely not only ripe area, but it's an area where there's going to be application after you're done. There's a need for it. And it's an area where you'll see that research likely get used. Negative or positive data. Remember, negative data is great data as well.
Yep. Well, fantastic. I think that's a great place to end on it. I'm glad we got to connect. I look forward to linking up with you in person at some point. Everybody, how can people look at your research? What's the website for your organization?
I should know that, shouldn't I? I believe it's partnership for the Delaware Estuary.org. And it's it's DelawareEstuary.org. And then on that web page, there's a variety of different drop-down menus. Under personnel, you can get my who we are. You can get my contact information. Under research, you can get information about our wetlands programs, our freshwater mussel programs, living shoreline programs, and also shell recycling. We're involved in shell recycling for use in these projects. So all of that information is available there. Fantastic.
And for our listeners and viewers, please like, subscribe, and share on your platform of choice. Please leave us some positive reviews, and you could always tweet at us, PM us on our Instagram, and email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. Thank you, Josh. Look forward to seeing you soon. Give my best to your family. Cheers.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Certainly, man.